Okay, so we're diving straight into the prehistoric world today. We're going to focus on, well, the real titans that used to walk the earth
Hmm.
and the star today, Brachiosaurus. I bet you can probably picture it right now.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the famous ones. But,
Hmm.
we're not just going with that mental image.
Right.
For this deep dive, we've really got into the sources, paleontological descriptions, research papers to unpack what we actually know about this arm lizard.
Arm lizard, yeah. That name itself gives us a pretty big clue straight away, doesn't it?
It really does.
So Brachiosaurus, late Jurassic North America. We're talking, what, about 155 to 143 million years ago?
That's the time frame, yeah. Late Jurassic.
Like the species name, Altithorax. That means deep chest.
Exactly. Deep chest. Another hint about its build, which we'll definitely get into.
Okay, so where does the story start? How did we first find out about this giant?
It all kicks off back in 1900, Colorado,
Mm.
near a place called Fruta. There was a paleontologist, Elmer S. Riggs, and his team. They were from the Field Museum in Chicago. Well, what would become the Field Museum.
Right.
And funnily enough, they weren't even looking for dinosaurs initially. They were after much older mammal fossils from the Eocene.
Wow, talk about a change of plans then. How did they stumble onto Brachiosaurus?
Well, Riggs had been in touch with his local guy, Stanton Merrill Bradbury.
Hmm.
He was a dentist, actually, but also an amateur fossil collector.
Ah, the local enthusiasts. They often play a key role.
Totally. And Bradbury told Riggs that, dinosaur bones had been popping up in that area for years. Now, Riggs was still focused on the mammals, but the museum back in Chicago, they were really keen to get their hands on a big sauropod skeleton.
Oh, really? Why was that?
There was a bit of institutional rivalry going on, keeping up with other museums. So they basically nudged Riggs, hey, maybe check out those dino bones.
Huh. Museum politics leading to major discoveries. I love it.
Yeah.
So Riggs goes to investigate. Then what?
So his field assistant, a guy named Harold William Menke, he's the one who actually found the first key piece, July 4th, 1900.
Independence Day discovery.
Yeah. He dug up this absolutely enormous bone, and apparently he yelled out something like, "It's the biggest thing yet."
Wow.
And that bone, it turned out to be the holotype humerus, the upper arm bone of Brachiosaurus. That was the first real clue.
The holotype. So that's the specimen everything else is based on, the defining one for the species.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
And here's a great little detail, because it was just so incredibly massive.
Yeah.
Riggs actually thought it was a femur at first, a thigh bone.
No way.
Seriously, it wasn't until they got it cleaned up back in the lab that they realized, hang on, this is an arm bone. Just imagine the scale we're talking about.
An arm bone mistaken for a leg bone, that really drives home the size. What else did they find there with that holotype specimen?
Okay, so the holotype skeleton, it's cataloged as FMNHP 25107. It includes that humerus, obviously, plus a right femur, a right hip bone, the ilium, a right shoulder bone, the coracoid, the cictrum, which is the fused hip vertebrae, the last 7 back vertebrae, 2 tail vertebrae, and a bunch of ribs.
So, a fair amount, but not complete.
Not complete, no. And interestingly, Briggs initially thought the coracoid was from the left side. Took a while to sort that out, but yeah, enough to give them a really good idea of the animal's unique proportions.
You mentioned not complete. Any clues about what happened to the rest of it?
Yeah, there were definite signs. The way the bones were found a bit scattered, particularly the ribs and the shoulder and arm bones were sort of off to one side, and the layers of rock around them changed. It all strongly suggested that water had moved them around.
Ah, like a flood or a river.
Exactly. Riggs himself figured a strong current probably washed the front part of the skeleton away while the back half was maybe already buried.
Huh.
They even found a hip bone from a diplodocus that seemed to have floated downstream and got stuck against the Brachiosaurus bones, like a little prehistoric logjam.
Wow, that paints a picture. So it didn't take Riggs long to realize this was something pretty special, right?
Not at all. He put out a short report in 1901 pointing out the unusual limb proportions, that long arm bone compared to the thigh bone, and just the sheer size.
Yeah.
Then in 1903, he formally named it Brachiosaurus altithorax, emphasizing, arm lizard and deep chest. And he made a big claim. He called it the largest known dinosaur at the time.
Largest known dinosaur. Okay, that definitely sets the scene. So let's dig into that. What were the key features that made Brachiosaurus altithorax stand out?
Well, the absolute key thing, like the name says, is the front legs being longer than the back legs.
Right, which is the opposite of most other sauropods.
Exactly. Most others are built more downhill from hips to shoulders. But Brachiosaurus, it had this deeply inclined trunk, shoulders way higher than its hips.
So kind of a built-in uphill slope to its back.
You got it. And probably a proportionally shorter tail because of that different balance. Think more like a giraffe's overall posture, but, scaled up massively. Much more than your typical long, level sauropod like Diplodocus.
So that classic image, the neck reaching high, that posture probably is pretty accurate for Brachiosaurus itself.
For Brachiosaurus altithorax, yes,
Yeah.
that seems right. Size-wise, estimates for the holotype put it somewhere between, say, 18 and 22 meters long. That's roughly 60 to 72 feet.
That's huge. What about weight?
Mass estimates vary quite a bit, as they often do, anywhere from about 28 up to maybe 47 metric tons. So yeah, a very hefty animal.
Wow.
And of course, like other sauropods, you have that disproportionately long neck and the relatively small skull compared to the body.
Classic sauropod features.
Right, and it's the namesake for the whole Brachiosauridae family, a group of related sauropods sharing some of these characteristics.
Okay, that brings up something I think trips a lot of people up. When we picture Brachiosaurus, like in movies, that iconic image might not actually be Brachiosaurus altithorax.
That's a really important point, yeah. You're absolutely right. The dinosaur we usually see, the one in Jurassic Park, for instance, that's generally based on Giraffatitan.
Giraffatitan.
Which is another brachiosaurid found in Tanzania in Africa. It was actually first described as a species of Brachiosaurus, Brachiosaurus branchi, back in 1914 by Werner Jenensch.
Ah, okay, so it used to be considered the same genus.
It did. But then, in 2009, scientists looked closer and decided it was different enough to warrant its own genus name. Hence, Giraffatitan.
So the Brachiosaurus in our heads is often really this African cousin, a case of mistaken fossil identity.
Pretty much. It shows how science evolves,
Yeah.
And sometimes popular culture takes a bit longer to catch up.
So why did they split them? What were the key differences that made scientists say, okay, this branchi needs its own genus?
It came down to a lot of specific differences in the bone's osteological differences. We're talking about 26 distinct features identified by researchers like Michael Taylor.
26? That's quite a few.
It is. More differences, actually, than between Diplodocus and Barosaurus, which are generally accepted as separate genera.
Okay, so significant differences. Like what, for example?
Well, things like body shape details.
Yeah.
Brachiosaurus altithorax seems to have had a proportionally longer series of back vertebrae, and also a longer and taller tail compared to Giraffatitan. Plus, we just have way more fossil material for Giraffatitan, especially from the Tendaguru Formation in Tanzania.
Yeah.
So we have a much more complete picture of what Giraffatitan looked like overall.
Right, so if you see a really complete mounted skeleton labeled Brachiosaurus in a big museum.
Chances are it's probably Giraffatitan,
Yeah.
especially the famous Berlin skeleton.
Good to know. Now, you mentioned other species that used to be called Brachiosaurus, too.
Yeah, there were a couple of others that got reassigned. There was Brachiosaurus italiensis from Portugal. That's now its own genus, Lusotiner.
Lusotitan, okay.
But it still has features that keep it firmly in the Brachiosaurid family. Things like loose spines on its vertebrae, a big crest on the humerus for muscle attachment, a long humerus overall, and the way its hip bone is tilted.
So, still related, just not Brachiosaurus.
Exactly. And then there was Brachiosaurus nugaretti from Algeria, known from really fragmented remains. It's now considered probably a distinct unnamed Brachiosaurid genus. There's even some confusion about its sacrum, the hip vertebrae. So yeah, the Brachiosaurus family tree has definitely had some pruning over the years.
It really sounds like a constant refinement. Okay, what about the head, the skull? That's often so important for understanding a dinosaur. What do we know about the Brachiosaurus skull?
Ah, the skull. Yeah,
Over that.
that's been a bit of a saga in itself. There's this one skull found way back in Felch Quarry in Colorado. Okay. It's got a couple of museum numbers, YPM 1986 and later USNM 5730. And over the years, it's been linked to all sorts of different sauropods. It was even initially thought it might belong to Brontosaurus.
Brontosaurus again. It pops up everywhere in these old debates.
It really does. Then later, a paleontologist named David Berman thought, this looks more like a Camarasaurus skull. Camarasaurus is another sauropod from the same area, but he thought maybe a vertebra found nearby could be Brachiosaurus. So confusion reigned for a while.
Sounds like it. When did it start getting linked more solidly to Brachiosaurus?
Well, the idea gained traction thanks to John McIntosh, who pointed it out to Kenneth Carpenter and Virginia Tidwell.
And what did Carpenter and Tidwell figure out?
In 1998, they formally studied it. They decided to assign it tentatively to Brachiosaurus spi, meaning an undetermined species of Brachiosaurus.
Tentatively. Why not definitively altithorax?
Because there were no overlapping bones found between this skull and the original holotype skeleton, so they couldn't be 100% sure it was the same species. Their main reason for linking it to Brachiosaurus was its similarity to the skull of B. branchi, which of course we now call Giraffathetin.
Right, the plot thickens, but I feel like that's not the end of the skull story.
Not quite. Fast forward to 2019. Michael Diemick and Matthew Carano took another look. They did more preparation, used CT scan.
Modern tech.
Exactly. And they actually removed a couple of bones that had been associated with the skull, a quadrate bone from the back, and a tooth. They found they didn't quite fit anatomically and were found a little ways away. They figured the tooth probably belonged to Camarasaurus, since other Camarasaurus teeth were found nearby. But crucially, they concluded that the main part of the Felch quarry skull most likely does belong to Brachiosaurus altithorax itself.
Really? Why the change of heart?
Their reasoning was basically, well, we have no solid evidence for any other type of brachiosaurid living in the Morrison Formation at that time. So by elimination, this skull is the most likely candidate for B. altithorax.
That makes sense. Paleontological detective work. So after all that, we finally have a good idea of what the Brachiosaurus altithorax skull looked like.
It seems so, yeah. Based on their reconstruction, it was about 70 centimeters long, so around 27 inches or so.
Okay.
It had that tall shape, like Giraffathetin, with a pretty long snout. The big openings on the sides and top of the skull, the temporal fenestrae, were quite large.
And any key differences from Giraffathetin?
One key thing was the connection between the frontal and nasal bones on top of the skull. It formed a U shape in Brachiosaurus, whereas it's more W-shaped in Giraffathetin.
Subtle but distinct.
Exactly. It also had a long neck on the occipital condyle. That's the bit that connects to the spine. The upper jawbone, the maxilla, was long and deep, and the lower jaws were robust.
What about the teeth?
The teeth were interesting. They had kind of a rough enamel surface in the upper jaw, maybe a bit more crinkled towards the front, generally spoon-shaped, good for stripping leaves. And the complete tooth they looked at from the premaxilla, the very front, didn't have any serrations, no little jagged edges.
Sounds like a skull built for grabbing leafy branches high up.
Okay, so we have the holotype. We have this likely skull. What about other bits and pieces found in North America? Is Brachiosaurus common?
Actually, no. Definitive Brachiosaurus altithorax material beyond that holotype is surprisingly rare.
Really?
Yeah. We can only be really confident when a new find includes bones that directly match parts of that original skeleton from Colorado. But there have been various tentative finds reported from other places, Colorado again, Oklahoma, Utah, Wyoming.
Any specific finds worth mentioning from those locations? Well, there's a shoulder blade fused with a coracoid, a scapulocoracoid from Dry Mesa Quarry in Colorado, BYU 9462.
Okay.
That bone was initially thought to belong to Ultrasaurus. Remember that one? Turned out Ultrasaurus was actually based on a mix of bones, some belonging to Supersaurus.
Another complex story.
Right. Anyway, this scapulocoracoid was later reassigned to Brachiosaurus maybe, and its size suggests it came from an individual a bit smaller than the holotype.
Interesting. Any others?
There's a big humerus, USNM 214003, from Potter Creek Quarry. It's large, definitely, but doesn't have quite enough unique Brachiosaurus features to be certain.
Okay.
But another specimen from that same quarry, Potter Creek, BYU 4744, that one include a vertebra, part of a hip, some limb bits that one is confidently referred to be altithorax.
Okay, so some definite confirmation.
For few, yeah. There's also a large rib and a vertebra found near Jensen, Utah. And from Dry Mesa Quarry again, there are two back vertebrae found joined together, BYU 13023. They look like the holotypes, but are a bit shorter.
Right. And didn't you mention a juvenile skeleton? That sounds really significant.
Yes, absolutely. The Tony specimen, SMA 0009, found in Wyoming.
Tony.
Yeah. It's a remarkably complete skeleton for a young sauropod. Really valuable find.
And it's Brachiosaurus.
Well, that's the thing. Initially, they thought it might be related to Diplodocus, but later analysis placed it firmly within the Brachiosauridae family. And maybe, possibly, B. altithorax itself.
Maybe. What's the uncertainty?
It shares some unique features with the B. altithorax holotype, which is a good sign. But there are also differences. These could just be because it's young, features that change as the animal grows up, what we call ontogenetic changes. Or potentially it could be a different, closely related species. We're not 100% sure.
What kind of differences are we talking about?
For example, the neck vertebrae in Tony are proportionally much shorter than in adult brachiosaurids. It suggests the neck got really long as they grew.
Wow, quite a growth spurt for the neck.
Yeah, and the humerus, the upper arm bone, is actually relatively stockier, more robust in the juvenile compared to the adult. But interestingly, the hand bones seem to have gotten more elongated as they matured.
Huh. Different parts growing at different rates.
Exactly. Another big change is likely the amount of air spaces inside the vertebrae, the pneumatization we talked about. Tony has some, but it's much less extensive than in adult sauropods. That likely increased significantly with age.
Fascinating. And does Tony tell us anything about when they matured?
Well, based on studies of bone histology and other sauropods and looking at specimens like Tony, it's thought that Brachiosaurus probably reached sexual maturity, able to reproduce well before it hit its absolute maximum size, maybe around 40% grown, possibly under 20 years old. That's an estimate, of course.
So even these giants had their awkward teenage growth phases. Okay, let's zoom out again. How does Brachiosaurus fit into the bigger picture of dinosaur evolution, its classification?
Right? Well, Riggs himself, when he first described it, knew it was something different. He put it in the big group Sauropoda, obviously, but he actually created the family Brachiosauridae just for it.
So right from the start, it had its own family, based mainly on those long arms.
Pretty much, yeah. That was the defining feature. Later on, Jansch, when he described the Tanzanian material, grouped his Brachiosaurus species with some other European sauropods like Pelorosaurus and Cetiosaurus into a subgroup, the Brachiosaurinae.
Okay.
And then for a lot of the 20th century, various other big sauropods from around the world got sort of lumped into Brachiosauridae based on just general similarities. But looking back, many of those assignments are now seen as pretty dubious. Our understanding has gotten a lot more detailed.
Right, using modern methods like cladistics, comparing lots of specific features.
Exactly. And those more rigorous cladistic analyses, they've actually made things more interesting, maybe more complicated. Some studies even question whether Brachiosauridae, as it was traditionally thought of, is really a natural group, a true clade.
Oh, so what's the alternative?
Some analyses suggest that what we call brachiosaurids might actually be a collection of more primitive, earlier branching members of a larger group called titanosauriforms.
Titanosauriforms, the group that includes the later giant titanosaurs.
That's the one. So Brachiosaurus and its relatives might sit kind of at the base of that massive evolutionary branch rather than being a completely separate side branch as previously thought.
Huh. Okay. And what about the relationship between Brachiosaurus altathorax and Giraffatin in these newer family trees? Are they still considered super close?
That's also been looked at closely, and the picture has shifted a bit. For a long time, they were seen as sister species, each other's closest relative.
Right.
Some cladistic studies still support that, but others actually place them in slightly different positions on the tree. For instance, a study by Demek back in 2012 suggested Giraffatin might be slightly more basal, meaning it branched off a little earlier than Brachiosaurus.
So maybe not quite identical twins on the family tree, but still close relatives.
Still, definitely close, yes. But the exact branching order is still something paleontologists are refining as more data comes in.
It's always evolving.
Always. But Michael Taylor, in 2009, did identify some key shared features, synapomorphies, that seem to unite the core brachiosaurids. Things like the humerus being at least as long as the femur.
The defining trait.
Right. And also having a very flattened femur shaft cross-sectionally. These are like unique bone signatures that help tie them together as a group, even if their exact position relative to titanosaurs is still debated.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, let's shift gears now to how Brachiosaurus actually lived. Its paleobiology. What can we say about its habits? Was it swimming in swamps, like in the old drawings?
Ah, the swamp idea. Yeah, that was really popular in the early 20th century. The thinking was these animals were just too enormous to support their weight on land, so they must have needed water buoyancy.
Makes intuitive sense, I guess.
It does, but Riggs himself, way back in 1904, argued strongly against it, specifically for Brachiosaurus.
Oh, even back then.
Yeah. He pointed out that its vertebrae were full of air pockets hollowed out,
Right.
which is not what you see in aquatic animals. And he argued its limbs and feet were clearly built for walking on land.
Right.
Brachiosaurus in particular, with its relatively slender limbs, high chest, and shorter tail compared to something like Diplodocus, seems even better adapted for land life. So the overwhelming view now, fully terrestrial.
So no wading Brachiosaurus then? Maybe just went for a drink.
Possibly. Stephen Serkis suggested maybe they went into water sometimes just to cool off, which seems plausible.
Okay. And how fast could it move on land? Not winning any races, I assume.
Definitely not. One estimate puts its walking speed at around 1.5 meters per second. That's, what, a bit over 3 miles per hour? A brisk walk for us, maybe?
A stately pace. Now, the neck. That incredible neck, how did it hold it? Was it straight up like a flagpole reaching for the absolute highest leaves?
The neck posture debate. That's been a
Oh,
big one for brachiosaurids.
yeah.
Yeah, early depictions often showed it almost vertical. But then, in 1999, Ken Stevens and Michael Parrish published a study suggesting the neck wasn't actually flexible enough for that extreme S-curve. They argued it was probably held much more horizontally.
Horizontally, that seems counterintuitive for a high browser.
It sparked a lot of debate, especially concerning museum mounts, like the one at the Field Museum, which does show an upward curve. Paleontologists there defended the pose, citing the long forelimbs and the angle of the backbone.
So where has the science landed more recently?
More recent work, like a study by Christian and Jemski in 2007 focusing on Giraffatitan, suggests a posture somewhere in between. They estimated the middle part of the neck was probably held at a pretty steep angle, maybe 60 to 70 degrees.
Okay, so not vertical, not horizontal, but definitely angled significantly upwards.
That seems to be the most likely scenario, yeah.
Yeah.
Allowing it to browse high, but maybe not needing a perfectly vertical pose.
Which still raises the question, pumping blood all the way up there, that must have been a huge challenge for its heart.
Oh, absolutely, a massive physiological challenge. Estimates suggest it might have needed a heart generating maybe double the blood pressure of a giraffe,
Wow.
which could mean a heart weighing something like 400 kilograms, almost 900 pounds.
Incredible. How did it manage that?
Well, the S-curve, even if not fully vertical, would help reduce the straight vertical distance. Maybe they lower their necks more when walking or drinking. And interestingly, a study looking at the inner ear structure of Giraffatitan, the
Yes.
balance organs, suggested they might have moved their necks more side to side while feeding, rather than huge up and down motions.
Like sweeping across a canopy.
Uh-huh.
Makes sense. So what was on the menu? What plants was it eating way up there?
It's definitely considered a high browser, probably specialized in foliage, maybe over 9 meters, that's 30 feet off the ground.
Wow.
Though it likely browsed lower down too, maybe between 3 and 5 meters sometimes. Diet-wise, think late Jurassic vegetation. Things like ginkgos, conifers, tree ferns, maybe large cycads.
And how much would something that big need to eat?
A lot. One estimate suggested maybe 200 to 400 kilograms of plant matter per day.
That's a huge amount of food. How did it even process that? Did it chew its cud?
No, not like cows. Sauropod feeding seems to have been simpler. More of an up and down jaw motion. They likely just stripped leaves and swallowed them with a minimal chewing.
So how did they digest it?
Probably relied heavily on hindgut fermentation. Basically a huge vat in their large intestine where bacteria break down all that tough plant fiber.
Nah. Okay.
Those spoon-shaped, chisel-like teeth were good for nipping off leaves and needles, not really for grinding. But if it spent a large part of its day just continuously cropping bite after bite, it could probably meet its needs. The estimated intake is actually a similar percentage of its body mass as what a modern elephant eats daily.
Right. And it was living alongside all those other huge sauropods in the Morrison Formation. How did they all find enough food? Did they compete?
That's where niche partitioning likely came in. Different sauropods specialized in feeding at different heights.
Ah, like different shelves in the supermarket.
Exactly. Brachiosaurus, reaching way up high, was tapping into food sources that the lower browsers like Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, Camarasaurus probably couldn't reach as easily.
Makes sense.
And it's interesting, some researchers suggest the relative scarcity of really tall conifers in the Morrison might explain why Brachiosaurus seems less common there than Giraffatitan was in Africa's Tendaguri Formation, where maybe those super tall trees were more abundant.
Huh. So the available vegetation might have limited its numbers.
Possibly.
Yeah.
And maybe Brachiosaurus, with slightly shorter arms and lower shoulders than Giraffatitan, wasn't quite as hyper-specialized for that extreme high browsing anyway.
Fascinating ecological puzzle. Okay, let's talk about another weird feature of those nostrils. Way up on top of the head. What was going on there? Snorkel.
The snorkel idea, yeah, that ties back to the old semi-aquatic theory. If you live in water, having nostrils high up makes sense. But as we shifted to a terrestrial view, that explanation didn't hold up. Lawrence Whitmer did some key work on this in 2001. He looked at modern animals and pointed out that the fleshy nostrils are almost always at the front of the bony nasal opening, not way up high.
So he thinks the actual nostrils were lower down on the snout?
That was his argument, yeah, inside that depression on the snout. Although, more recently, Hallett and Weddell proposed a counter-argument. They suggested maybe the nostrils were high up above the bony opening, specifically to allow them to breathe while dipping their snouts down to drink water from the ground.
Okay, another possibility. Any other ideas?
Well, Stephen Cherkas wondered if that big nasal opening maybe housed tissues for an enhanced sense of smell, or maybe even supported some kind of fleshy crest, perhaps for display.
A display crest. Interesting. What about the idea of a trunk, a proboscis?
That's been debated too. Some studies looked at the hole in the skull for the facial nerve, the nerve that would control a trunk in various sauropods, and found it was pretty small, arguing against a trunk. But Knoll and colleagues pointed out that this nerve opening seems larger in Giraffatitan specifically. So, while maybe not for Brachiosaurus or other sauropods, the possibility might still be open for Giraffatine having some kind of trunk-like structure. It's still debated.
So the nostril position and function remain a bit mysterious. Okay, what about metabolism? An animal that big, warm-blooded, cold-blooded, something else?
The general consensus now leans towards them being homeothermic, maintaining a stable body temperature, and probably endothermic, generating their own heat internally. Basically warm-blooded, especially while growing.
But they were huge. Wouldn't they overheat?
That was definitely a concern raised early on. Dale Russell, back in 1989, used Brachiosaurus as an example of why dinosaurs couldn't be warm-blooded, citing the huge caloric needs and the risk of cooking themselves from the inside out.
Right.
But Martin Sander, later on, pointed out that Russell's calculations use older, likely overestimated mass figures, and crucially, didn't account for the extensive air sac system.
Ah, the air sacs again. How would they help with cooling?
Because those air sacs extended throughout the body cavity and even into the bones, they provided a huge internal surface area. Air flowing through could have helped dissipate heat very effectively, like an internal air conditioning system.
Wow.
Plus, some have suggested that the large nasal arch itself might have acted as a radiator, helping to cool the blood going to the brain through evaporation.
So, multiple ways to potentially stay cool despite their size. Tell me more about these air sacs, like birds.
Very much like birds, yes.
Yeah.
It's a really sophisticated system. Air flowed in one direction through these sacs connected to relatively stiff lungs, much more efficient at extracting oxygen than our mammal lungs, where air flows in and out.
And they invaded the bones.
They did. Little extensions called diverticula grew from the air sacs and actually hollowed out parts of the skeleton, especially the vertebrae. This process, pneumatization, made the bones lighter, crucial for such a giant animal.
So lighter bones and better breathing and maybe cooling, those air sacs were doing a lot.
Absolutely. Hallett and Wadle even did a detailed reconstruction of what the air sac system might have looked like, specifically in B. altithorax. It's a key part of understanding sauropod biology.
Truly remarkable physiology. Okay, finally on the biology front, what about growth? How did a Brachiosaurus go from a hatchling to that enormous adult? We touched on it with Tony.
Right, Tony gives us our best glimpse into Brachiosaurus ontogeny, or growth. Carbolito and colleagues used it to reconstruct how they might have developed.
And we saw some potential changes, like the neck getting longer, arms maybe getting relatively more slender, hand bones elongating.
Exactly. And the pneumatization, the air spaces in the bones, likely becoming much more extensive as they got older. Some features in the vertebrae, like how compressed the neural spines are or the development of certain bony ridges, might also be linked to age and maturity.
And you mentioned they probably started reproducing before they were fully grown?
Yeah, that seems likely, based on bone studies and other sauropods. Reaching sexual maturity relatively early, maybe around 40% of max size, perhaps under 20 years old. It's a common strategy in animals that face high juvenile mortality, reproduce early and often.
Makes sense for survival. Okay, let's put Brachiosaurus back into its world. The paleoecology. What was the Morrison Formation like back then?
We touched on it late Jurassic, Western North America. The environment is interpreted as semi-arid. Think distinct wet and dry seasons. Big flat floodplains, rivers winding through.
We're definitely not alone out there.
Not by a long shot.
Yeah.
The Morrison was famous for its sauropod diversity. You had Apatosaurus, Berosaurus, Camarasaurus, Diplodocus, Haplacanthosaurus, Supersaurus, all sharing the landscape.
Their ecosystem of giants.
Truly. Although, as we mentioned, fossil surveys suggest Brachiosaurus itself was actually one of the less common ones among them. A relative rarity despite its size.
Interesting. What else lived there? Predators? Other herbivores?
Oh yeah. Lots of theropod predators. Small ones like Caparian, Ornitholestes, mid-sized ones like Stoxosaurus or Etosaurus, and then the big guys. Allosaurus was the most common large predator, plus Torvosaurus, and the truly huge Saurophaganax.
So plenty of danger, even for a young Brachiosaurus.
Absolutely. Ceratosaurus in particular might have even specialized in tackling sauropods sometimes. And then you had lots of other plant eaters too. Ornithischians like Camptosaurus, Dryosaurus, Othnielia, the armored Gargoyleosaurus, and of course Stegosaurus with his plates and tail spikes.
A classic Jurassic lineup.
It really is. Plus fish, frogs, salamanders, turtles. And the plants ranged from river gallery forests to more open fern savannas with cycads, ginkgos, conifers, a really dynamic ecosystem.
Sounds incredible. Finally, let's talk about its impact beyond paleontology. Its cultural significance. It's definitely captured the public imagination.
It really has. It's funny, Riggs apparently tried to keep the discovery quiet initially, maybe worried about competition.
Didn't work, I guess.
Not for long. News got out pretty quickly. Local papers, then national ones, announced this discovery of one of the largest dinosaurs ever. Sauropods always grab attention because of their size, and Riggs definitely played up the scale of Brachiosaurus.
And it's been a museum icon ever since.
Definitely. You can see those big replica skeletons in Chicago, one outside the Field Museum, another one greeting you at O'Hare Airport. It's become really symbolic.
But again, with the caveat that the image we often see
is usually based more on giraffatitan. Yeah, it's important to keep saying that. But Brachiosaurus itself still holds that iconic status. It even has an asteroid named after it, 9954 Brachiosaurus.
An asteroid. That's cool. And of course, the movie appearance that cemented its fame for a whole new generation.
Jurassic Park, yeah. Absolute pivotal moment. It was the first fully CGI dinosaur shown in the film. That scene where Grant and Sattler see it for the first time.
Unforgettable.
Totally. The effects were mind-blowing back in '93. And apparently the animators based its movement on a mix of a giraffe's gait and an elephant's sense of weight. They also built a huge animatronic head and neck for the close-ups, like the feeding scene.
Yeah.
And fun fact, the digital model they created for Brachiosaurus was later tweaked and reused for the Ronto creatures in the Star Wars special editions.
No way. From the Jurassic to Tatooine, that's quite a legacy.
Isn't it?
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Brachiosaurus, what are the main things we should take away?
Well, I think it's clear Brachiosaurus haltothorax was a really unique sauropod. Those long forelimbs, the sloping back, its whole posture was distinctive.
Yeah.
Its discovery was significant, and while we're still refining its exact place on the family tree, especially relative to Giraffatitan, we have a much better picture now of its anatomy, its likely high-browsing lifestyle on land, those amazing air sacs.
Right, the whole package.
And we've seen it was a relatively rare giant in its Morrison Formation home, but it's had this huge lasting impact on popular culture.
And critically, remember the distinction. The super famous image is usually Giraffatitan branchi, the African cousin, not the original North American Brachiosaurus altithorax.
Exactly. That distinction is key. And it really highlights how science works. It's a process. We're always learning, always refining, based on new finds and new analyses.
So the story of the arm lizard isn't finished yet.
Not by a long shot. Who knows what the next discovery might tell us? Maybe a more complete skull or fossils that bridge the gap between juvenile and adult. It keeps things exciting.
Definitely food for thought. Makes you wonder what's still out there waiting to be found and what new insights it might bring about these incredible animals.